Attention prayer. In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. All praise is due to Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, Master of this day of judgment in which we now live. Thee alone do we serve, and Thee alone do we beseech for help. O Allah, guide us on the right path, the path of those upon whom Thou hast bestowed favors, not the path of those upon whom Thy wrath is brought down, nor of those who go astray after they have heard Thy teachings. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Narrative Podcast. I'm Sister Adria Muhammad, aka Queen Adria, and I am so happy to be back with you today. Last week, we celebrated the Juneteenth holiday, and we were on location in North Carolina and in Washington, D.C. And I'm happy to be back with you to share with you part two of the Timeline to Freedom. Give us one moment and we'll be right back. Thank you. We're here to narrate the culture and heritage of Black folks in America. Our culture, our heritage, and our history will not be erased. We're here to educate, elevate, and celebrate who we are and what we do. Happy holidays for Black folks. Thank you for joining us. Again, our theme for this month is Juneteenth. And for those of you who don't know, this Black holiday, Juneteenth, is celebrated each year on June 19th to mark the day in 1865 when Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation and free the last enslaved Black people in America. The proclamation was actually signed in September of 1862 and made effective January 1, 1863. So their freedom was delayed by 2 years. The idea that enslaved people in Texas were completely unaware of their freedom is a common myth, but many enslaved individuals already knew about the proclamation but remained in bondage because the slaveholders resisted and did not comply with the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth is often referred to as Freedom Day, which symbolizes the delayed but hard fought liberation of Black people in America. During our premiere presentation, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, or the emancipation of the mind, and what it must have been like to walk off the plantation with absolutely nothing, not even your own name. We also introduced you to two people who are the champions of the effort to make Juneteenth a national holiday, and that is Representative John Myers, and who is considered one of the fathers of Juneteenth, and Dr. Opal Lee, who is the grandmother of Juneteenth. So shout out to both of them. While these two champions did dedicate their lives to fight to make Juneteenth a national holiday, they did not do it alone. We the people, especially the Black folks, joined the fight and worked together to make it happen. This is how we keep our history and culture from being erased, by getting involved. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to this channel, like it, and share it so others can enjoy the information and join the Holidays for Black Folks community here on YouTube. Also, we discussed in our previous live stream that there are more than 10 Black holidays that must be celebrated, not just by Black people, but by everyone, because Black history is American history. These Black holidays are Martin Luther King Jr. Day, Black Love Day, Savior's Day, Harriet Tubman Day, Black Marriage Day, International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, Juneteenth, July 4th, 1930, Holy Day of Atonement, Reconciliation, Responsibility, which is the anniversary of the Million Man March, Mothers of Civilization Day, and Kwanzaa. Visit our website at www.holidayswithblackfolks.com and click on our live chat box to ask Miss Kichi about each of these holidays and anything else you would like to know about holidays for Black folks. The more we celebrate, the more we are unified. And the more we are unified, the more we thrive. So make sure you like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Oh, last but not least, we need help. Pulling off this presentation is a lot. We are building community and we need your help. Holidays for Black folks is looking for volunteers. If you would like to help us narrate the culture and heritage of Black folks in America and promote mainstream celebration of holidays that are for Black people in America, please email us a letter, a resume, or both, and let us know the skills that you have and how you would like to contribute to this movement. Send your communication to info@holidaysforblackfolks.com. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Okay, are we ready to get into the meat? We have a lot of information to share with you today, and that is part 2 of the Narrative Podcast. Now, I'm going to bring up a slide and see if I can do this efficiently today. Let's see her. Okay, I think I got it. Oh yeah, I do. Okay, we're at part 2 of the Narrative Podcast, and I have no idea what our screen looks like, but we are here. Let's see. Okay, yes, we are here. And okay, so I can start by reviewing the information we shared in part 1 of our podcast. And let's just kind of do a quick review. We started prior to 1300s, but actually, we went all the way back to the beginning of humanity. And what we discussed is that, um, basically, we during the week 2 of the narrative, we began exploration of this historical holiday as Juneteenth, a timeline to freedom. In the spirit of Sankofa, we look back at the history of Black folks before slavery began and the proof that Black people are the original people of the earth. Since the oldest human remains were discovered in Ethiopia and they belonged to a Black woman, we discussed the fact that the very first people to set foot on the North American continent were, in fact, free Black people. Our review took us from the historical travels as the original people of the earth through the 1300s and the 1400s, when the Spanish and the Portuguese explored and initiated the European slave trade with what was considered divine permission from Pope Nicholas V from the Vatican of the Roman Catholic Church. So let me pause right here, though. I would like to correct one thing I said during our last presentation. I said that sometime in 1562 and 1564, Sir John Hawkins launched England's first transatlantic slaving voyage. Queen Elizabeth I recognized the profitability of the trade and leased him a Navy warship named Jesus of Lubeck for his second voyage. I said this made uh, the British monarchy a direct financial investor in chattel slavery. It actually made the English monarchy an investor in chattel slavery, as Queen Elizabeth I was England's monarch, not Britain's. It was King Charles I and King Charles II, um, who are the monarchs who ushered in Britain into the slave trade. So please note that correction. Thank you. Um, One thing I wanted to also point out that we reviewed was, so that took us from the 1300s to all the way up to the 1700s. Not only did we look at the tragic initiation and onslaught of chattel slavery, we also looked at the creativity, the ingenuity, and the intellectual aptitude of our people in spite of the attempted genocide they were experiencing. We shared with you that in 1773, a young, kidnapped, and enslaved woman named Phyllis Wheatley published a book of classical poetry called Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, which was released in London. This collection is highly significant in literary history as it made Wheatley the first Black, the first enslaved person in the United States, and only the third woman in colonial America to publish a book. Her book didn't just entertain, it was a political weapon. She proved that you can chain a person's body, but you cannot lock up the brilliance of the human mind. Now, I promised you when we did that, when I introduced that information, that I would share one of my favorite poems written by Phyllis Wheatley with you. So I'd like to do that right now, and feel free to follow along with me. And I skipped a lot of information. Okay, so Phyllis Wheatley was 6 or 7 years old when she was kidnapped from the coast of Africa, and about by within 12 years, she was a published author, and I think that's brilliant. One of her poems, which is quite controversial, and you'll see why, is called "On Being Brought from Africa to America" by Phyllis Wheatley. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and joined the angelic train." That's my favorite. It's thought provoking. This poem was controversial because some people felt like it was a praise over slavery, and they strongly disagreed over the actual meaning of the literary piece. Nevertheless, she managed to get it published, and it is still profoundly present among many Black poets and literary giants. So, hats off to our sister, Phyllis Wheatley. So, as we reflect on our timeline to freedom, we made it to the 1700s and are headed to the 1800s. Okay. And I want to take you back a few minutes to the beginning of the slave trade in terms of our review. And let's see if we can get you back. So we actually identified Africa as the cradle of civilization. That is a well-known fact because the oldest human remains found in Africa, in Ethiopia, were the remains of a Black woman. And we discovered many things about our past through archaeology. We understand that Black people are the original people of the earth, as undisputed. Black people built sophisticated civilizations and explored the planet long before other modern races evolved or were grafted from us. Um, the emperor of Mali in the year 1311 abdicated his throne to personally command a massive fleet of 2,000 ships, demonstrating that Black societies engaged in deep maritime exploration. And this basically proves that Black people were on the planet roaming the earth long before the exploration of the Spanish and the Portuguese, long before the onset of the transatlantic slave trade. In Portuguese, it was the explorers sought permission from the Vatican, from the Roman Catholic Church, to kidnap the first free West Africans, which initiated the European exploitation of Africans. In June 18th, 1452, Pope Nicholas V sanctioned the and provided the legal framework for global human trafficking. And this is Pope Nicholas V. Also, in late October 1526, Spain attempted to found its first colony on the mainland North America called San Miguel de Guadalupe. I have a problem with that name. Guadalupe. I hope that's correct. And I have to correct myself on that. But they had 100 Africans that revolted and collapsed the colony, forcing the Spanish to flee while the Africans escaped into the forest and swamps. And those people are now known as the Geechee Gullah people and also the Maroons. And so they retained their African culture and practice their culture today after many, many years of being free on the North American continent, having escaped from their captors. Sometime in 1562, Sir John Hawkins, he launched the first transatlantic slaving voyage, and Queen Elizabeth, this is the information I was sharing with you earlier, Queen Elizabeth actually made him her commander of her naval fleet, and thus the English got involved and participated in the transatlantic slave trade. She gave him her coat of arms and made him the commander, and the rest is history of how many voyages they took throughout the period of the transatlantic slave trade. And as I said, Black people are the most resilient people on the planet. We've taken the best shot, the worst shot, and we're still here because the power of Blackness cannot be stopped. Now, not only did we have our creativity and our academic aptitude, we also shared with you in 1773 about Phyllis Wheatley, but we had some very, very powerful, prominent people in America working for the liberation of Black people. So as we proceed on our timeline and going from the 1700s into the 1800s, I am reminded of the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. The abolitionists were fighting to end slavery politically by making it completely illegal to own slaves. And the Underground Railroad was a complex system of escape routes and hiding places that supported the escape of enslaved Black folks. So you had people working for the physical liberation, where they were running away, and there was a network of people who thought slavery was immoral, and they supported the escape of Black people from plantations. So that's the Underground Railroad. But then you have the abolitionists, who were the educated, who were fighting to end slavery legally, because during that time, the actual ownership of slave was legal in the United States. It was not considered a crime. It was a legal enterprise. Blacks and whites worked together to provide safe haven to those on the run from slavery. The coded language and carefully coordinated resources helped make possible the seemed impossible, but it was dangerous for the slaves and those who aided in their escape. Two of our most famous abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, who worked on the political side, and Harriet Tubman, who worked on both the political side and the physical side, play very prominent roles in the movement. We plan to discuss them in great detail in our future presentations. But today, we want to share with you another abolitionist whose effort might surprise you. And that person is none other than John Brown, who was born May 9th, 1800. And he lived until December 2nd, 1859. So he was 59 years old when he died. The story of John Brown is interesting because you may have already learned of the role of Puritans and Quakers, the role they played in the Underground Railroad. They are considered evangelical or devout believers in their faith, they're also considered peaceful people. But enters John Brown. John Brown, born May 9th, 1800, was an American abolitionist in the decades preceding the American Civil War. So long before the Civil War ever happened, he was an evangelical Christian of strong religious convictions. Brown was profoundly influenced by the Puritan faith of his upbringing. He believed that he was an instrument of God, raised to strike the death blow to slavery in the United States, a sacred obligation. Brown was the leading exponent of violence in the American abolitionist movement, believing it was necessary to end slavery after decades of peaceful effort had failed. Brown said that in working to free the enslaved, he was following Christian ethics, including the Golden Rule and the Declaration of Independence, which states that all men are created equal. He stated that in his view, these two principles meant the same thing. Brown first gained national attention when he led anti-slavery volunteers and his sons during the Bleeding Kansas crisis of the 1850s, which was a state-level civil war over whether Kansas would enter the Union or the United States as a United State, as a slave state, or as a free state. He was dissatisfied with abolitionist pacifism, saying that pacifists, these men, are all talk. What we need is action. Action. In May 1856, Brown and his sons killed 5 supporters of slavery in the Potawatomi Massacre. Brown then commanded anti-slavery forces at the Battle of Blackjack, and the Battle of Osawatomie. In October 1859, John Brown led a raid on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which later became part of West Virginia. He intended to start a slave liberation movement that would spread south, and he prepared a provisional constitution for the revised slavery-free United States that he hoped to bring about. He seized the armory, but 7 people were killed and 10 or more were injured. Brown intended to arm slaves with weapons from slavery and weapons from the armory, but only a few slaves joined his revolt. Those of John Brown's men who had not fled were killed or captured by militia and the U.S. Marines, which were led by General Robert E. Lee. Brown was tried for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, the murder of 5 men, and inciting a slave insurrection. He was found guilty of all charges and he was hanged December 2nd, 1859. He was the first person executed for treason in the history of the United States. The Harper's Ferry raid and John Brown's trial escalated tensions that in the next year led to the South's long threatened secession from the Union and contributed to the start of the American Civil War. Southerners feared that others would soon follow John Brown's steps and promote slave rebellions. He was widely reviewed as a hero and an icon in the North. Enters Abraham Lincoln. Here comes Abraham Lincoln. 1 year after the execution of John Brown on November 6, 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected to serve his first term as the first Republican and the 16th president of the United States. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. Prior to the election of Abraham Lincoln, there were 34 states in the USA altogether. Once he was elected, 11 states withdrew or seceded from the Union in rebellion. These states made up the Confederacy. They elected their own president and considered themselves a separate nation, which was illegal. There were 20 free states that remained in the Union and 5 slave states that did not secede from the Union. This made up 25 states in the Union, in the United States, after the succession of those 11 Southern states. The District of Columbia was and still is not a state. The conflict between the Confederate and the Union was about, or the North and the South, which is what they were also called. The Confederate is the South and the Union is the North. The conflict was about the following issues, with the dispute over slavery at the center of the conflict. The number one was slavery. Southern states relied on free enslaved labor for their agricultural economy, particularly for cotton and tobacco, while the North was increasingly industrialized and opposed the expansion of slavery into new Western territories. So as America was growing and expanding into the West, states like Kansas and those Western locations were gradually joining the Union. And the dispute was, are they going to be slave states or are they going to be free states? And of course, the Republicans wanted them to join as free states and not as slave states. The South wanted them to join as slave states because they wanted to protect their economic way of life and the economy of the slave trade. The states also, another reason they were in conflict is because of states' rights and political disputes. Southern leaders wanted states to have the right to govern themselves, including the right to maintain slavery. They wanted to make sure that they were able to maintain their way of life and keep the agricultural economy growing on the backs of Black people. Election of Abraham Lincoln was another point of contention. Southern states believed that they lost their political voice and way of life with the election of Abraham Lincoln because he was against the expansion of slavery into those Western states. When he got elected, the Southern states, those 11 states, seceded from the Union in rebellion to the United States. And another reason they fought was because of the rebellion to the Union. It was considered illegal to withdraw from the Union, and Confederate states established themselves as a separate territory and elected their own president. That was not observed by the Union or the United States. So once those 11 states withdrew from the United States and dropped their membership in the country, they were considered the rebellion or a coup, or, we use a lot of terms to describe that. But basically, they rebelled against the country and became traitorous. They established themselves as another or as a separate territory, but that was not observed by the United States, what was remaining of the United States. So the war. And then what set it off? The war began physically on April 12th, 1861, which is a year after, or the first year of President Abraham Lincoln's administration. The war began April 12th, 1861, when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. So basically, in Charleston, South Carolina, they the forces attacked Fort Sumter and they took it over. They won that battle and assumed control of Fort Sumter, and the war was on at that point. So ultimately, 11 states seceded from the Union and fought against the United States. Um, and those 11 states, starting with South Carolina um, in December of 1860. But from January, the first one was South Carolina. They succeeded in December 20th, 1860. But from January to June, other states succeeded, and all 11 states became the Confederate that no longer wanted to be a part of the United States of America. So those states were in order: first, South Carolina, December 20th, Mississippi, January 9th, Florida, January 10th, Alabama, January 11th. So 3 days in a row, one day, one state at a time, these states succeeded for the Union. Georgia on January 19th, Louisiana on January 26th, Texas, February 1st, Virginia, April 17th, Arkansas, May 6th, North Carolina, May 20th, and Tennessee, June 8th. All from January to June, all 11 states were seceded from the United States and established themselves as a separate territory. Now, the Civil War began in 1861 and continued until 1865. So it was 4 years of fighting. In 1862, President Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which warned the Confederate States that all enslaved people within their borders would be free if the rebellion did not end by January 1st. So if they would have stopped fighting, then the slaves would have they would have remained slaves. So let's pause right here. This means that only the slaves in the 11 states that made up the Confederacy would be free. Black folks in the 5 slave states that did not succeed would not be free. Those 5 states were Maryland, West Virginia, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri. So these are states that were able to keep their slaves because They did not withdraw from the United States. Only the slaves in the Confederate States, those 11 Confederate States, were set free by the Emancipation Proclamation. Black history is American history. And this is why we cannot, that is not the only reason, but we cannot erase Black history because Black history is American history. The whole Civil War was fought over the issue of slavery. January 1, 1863, the final Emancipation Proclamation officially took effect, fundamentally transforming the Civil War from a conflict to preserve the Union into a battle for human freedom by inviting slaves in the Confederate States to join the Union Army and fight for their freedom while Black folks enslaved in the border states remained in bondage. And if you look at this map, you will see that the Union states are the ones in blue, the Confederate states are the ones in purple, and the yellow or the gold states are territories. They're not states yet. So as America was expanding into that western territory of Dakotas, the Washington Territory, Utah Territory, Colorado, Nebraska, Indian Territory, and New Mexico Territory, the Republicans opposed those states coming into the Union as slave states. But the South wanted them to maintain slavery and come in to the Union as slave states, slaveholding states. So, with the presentation of the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln offered freedom to the Black people who were enslaved in the South. This encouraged them to join the Union Army in order to fight for their freedom. While the Black people who were in those 5 border states that were considered slave states, the rest of the Union were considered free states. But those 5 remaining slave states that were still a part of the United States, they got to keep their slaves. The slaves in the South were freed by Abraham Lincoln with the presentation of the Emancipation Proclamation, but joining the Union Army to fight for their freedom was no easy feat. For those enslaved in Confederate states, there were a few ways to join the Army. One way was self-emancipation by running away from the plantations on foot, horseback, or by water to reach the nearby Union camps. Also, there was the contraband decision. In 1861, Union General Benjamin Butler declared escaping slaves a contraband of war, meaning the Union military would not return the escaped slaves to the Confederate owners, because it used to be if a slave ran away from a state, then they could be captured and taken back to the plantation owner. But the Union General Benjamin Butler declared that the escaped slaves would not be returned to the Confederate owners. The other way was family flight. Entire families often escaped together, enduring severe hunger, weather, and dogs, tracking hounds, like hunting dogs. This is when Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad was in full effect, right along with the abolitionist movement. Harriet Tubman helped hundreds, if 1,000, Black folks escape to freedom. She also served in the Union Army as a spy, and she infiltrated behind enemy lines, behind the Confederate lines to rescue captured Union soldiers or POWs. And I'll tell you more about Harriet as we get to Harriet Tubman Day. As Union armies advanced into the South, they physically liberated plantations. Thousands of Black folks attached themselves to the Union regiments that were passing through. So this was another way that Black people who were enslaved in the South could escape slavery and join the Union Army, because the Union Army was advancing on the Confederacy. And as they moved through, the slaves would run and join the ranks of those Union soldiers who were passing through. The Union troops established secure refugee camps known as contraband camps near military bases for the slaves to run to. So there were Black people in the Civil War. Black people have fought in America's wars as early as the Revolutionary War, definitely in the Civil War. And this picture depicts a troop of Black soldiers who were finally armed to fight in the Union against the South. When they first joined the Union Army, they were denied access to weapons because the soldiers that they were supposed to be fighting along with were afraid that the Black people, the Black men with guns, would turn on them and shoot them because of the treatment they had received in chattel slavery. They were actually put on the front lines during the Civil War, and the first to die during the war, and had no guns to defend themselves. But eventually, as you see in this picture, they were allowed to hold arms and fight in the Union. But a lot of time went by before this actually happened. So in thinking about the fact that these soldiers that you see in this picture came from the Confederate States, and they were fighting against their former slave owners, their former owners on the plantations. I think that what was really disturbing for the Union soldiers was to see Black men gunning down white men, because even though the Black people were set free to join the Army, the bigotry still existed. And the thought that Black people were less than human, that ideology was still there. It didn't just go away. Freeing the slaves from the Confederate States was a strategic plan to help win the war and ultimately maintain the Union. Which leads us to the question of, why didn't Lincoln free all the slaves at once? I mean, he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Why didn't he just let them all go? But the issue of slavery was fraught with political pitfalls. On one hand, Lincoln was under pressure to attack slavery from Congress and from some of his own generals. But Lincoln was beholden to those Union border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, those. Those were where some slave owners were loyal to the Union men. Lincoln was afraid to seize their private property or their slaves and lose those states to the Confederacy. So he exempted them from the Emancipation Proclamation to keep them in the Union and not allow them to join up with the Confederacy, which would have been a game changer if they did. The timing of the proclamation was also political. Lincoln penned his first copy of the Emancipation Proclamation in July of 1862, when Union armies were losing one battle after another. But Secretary of State William Seward persuaded Lincoln that the emancipation, if he persuaded Lincoln that the emancipation then would look like the last measure of exhausted government, stretching forth its hands to Ethiopia, instead of Ethiopia stretching forth her hands to the government. Now, Ethiopia, these were his words, that Ethiopia in the mid 19th century, Black Americans were sometimes called Ethiopians, which takes us back to the origination of, of humanity. Black people, the oldest human remains of Black people were found in Ethiopia, and they knew that back then. So the ideology that Black people were less than human or didn't have a history was just a flat out lie, because in the mid 19th century, Black Americans, or Black people in America, because we weren't citizens, but Black people in America were sometimes called Ethiopians. That's why the Secretary of State William Seward said the last measure, that it would look like a last measure of an exhausting government, stretching forth its hands to Ethiopia, instead of Ethiopia stretching forth her hands to the government. He was actually talking about Black people as the original people of the earth. Keeping to, because the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to rebelling Confederate states, the institution of slavery in the loyal border states required either direct action or the National Abolition Amendment to end. Those 5 states abolished slavery in different times between 1864 and 1865. And here's how it went. Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass were working alongside each other, both physically to end slavery by physically removing slaves from the plantations and by working towards the emancipation of slaves politically. They actually lived to see the Emancipation Proclamation signed. And through, although the proclamation was signed, there were states that didn't immediately release their slaves. And even Abraham Lincoln said these words prior to finalizing the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free." He said this in August 22nd, 1862, and he signed the Emancipation Proclamation in September 1862. So, based on these words, we know that Abraham Lincoln, his primary interest was in saving the Union and keeping the United States of America a sovereign nation. So, with the signing of the Emancipation and those 5 states still holding slaves, it was determined at the state level for those 5 states that slaves would be free. They were exempted from the Emancipation Proclamation. So they had to make the decision at the state level about the freeing of those slaves in their states. Maryland ended slavery or emancipated slaves on November 1st, 1864, through a new state constitution. Missouri freed slaves January 11th, 1865, by a state convention vote. West Virginia admitted to the Union as a free state, with gradual emancipation officially ending slavery on February 3rd, 1865. All of these three states freed their slaves prior to the 13th Amendment, or the enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. Delaware and Kentucky remained the final two states to legally hold enslaved people until the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. They did this on December 6, 1865. So the emancipation went into effect January 1, 1865, and Missouri changed its made a convention vote on January 11th, 1865, to ratify their agreement, the 13th Amendment. So these 5 states did succeed for the Union, but not all of them did so eagerly. On June 19th, 1865, word of the proclamation and the end of the Civil War finally reached Galveston, Texas. Now remember, Texas was a Confederate state. This milestone is celebrated today as Juneteenth. But Delaware and Kentucky did not ratify the 13th Amendment until December 6, 1865. So technically, they did not declare themselves a free state until after Juneteenth. And guess what? Neither did Mississippi. They did not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1995. That's right, 1995. Slavery became legally unconstitutional in Mississippi in December 1865, when the 13th Amendment was ratified nationwide, all of the U.S. illegal. However, Mississippi did not officially vote to ratify the amendment until March 16, 1995, due to a missing clerical filing. It was not formally recorded in the Federal Register until February 7th, 2013. Now here's the timeline of the state of Mississippi's ratification process. In 1865, the U.S. Constitution was amended to abolish slavery, but Mississippi lawmakers rejected the 13th Amendment. In 1995, now you're talking about 30 years later, in 1995, not 30 years later, 130 years later, the Mississippi state legislature unanimously voted to ratify the amendment, but state officials failed to notify the U.S. archivist, leaving the ratification unofficial. So it was an unofficial ratification of the 13th Amendment agreement, but it was officially ratified February 7th, 2013. In 2013, after a resident discovered the 130-year oversight prompted by watching the movie. He was watching the movie Lincoln, and Mississippi submitted the paperwork. The director of the Federal Register officially certified it on February 7th, 2013. And from what I understand, there are many, many laws on the books that were written during the transatlantic slave trade and prior to the Civil War that are still on the books. And this is why right now we're still fighting for voting rights. because of some old, antiquated law that has not been amended. So the fight continues in America for the freedom and the liberation and the acknowledgement of Black people as citizens of the United States who have the right to participate in the electoral process. And there are other antiquated laws that are affecting us till this day. And something as simple as a clerical error or an oversight maintained slavery in one state for 130 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. Thank you for joining me. I pray you are enlightened by the information shared today. Join me next Saturday for the Narrative Podcast. Enjoy the rest of your day. Have a great week. And please subscribe, like, and share this channel with your family and friends if you haven't already done so. Turn on your notifications so you won't miss the next time we gather to narrate our culture and celebrate holidays for Black folks.